essentially getting back to the disproportionate exposures and impacts that oftentimes fall upon people of low income and people of color, minority group populations. And letting climate change move forward, business as usual, emissions, we see those communities that are going to be hardest hit, disproportionately at least. So arresting climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I don't want to say in any way, shape, or form, but in general, just addressing climate change is going to disproportionately benefit those communities for the same reasons that the impacts are currently disproportionately hitting those communities. So that's just the first thing to recognize. But I still think it's important to realize that a carbon tax and things along that nature are going to have disproportionately hit low-income communities, people who depend greatest proportion of their paycheck is to pay electricity and transportation and home heating. So, there's ways to go about ensuring that those communities get basically a greater share of rebates as it relates to, or at least reduced taxes. And that's all stuff that we can work into policy, different income brackets that will subject people to different percentages of a carbon tax, to take that example. And that's something that I'm all for doing. It's also noteworthy that some of the carbon tax proposals out there, in fact, the most popular ones are those that actually give money back to the population. So not necessarily just taking a tax and just putting it all into government. These are, in some cases, revenue neutral from the perspective of the government. They don't actually give money to the government. They give the money 100% back to the population. And that can be a powerful way to gain popularity for a carbon tax, but also to ensure that, the communities aren't going to be hit by something like that nearly as greatly. And there's, in fact, recently I was reading a book by Robert Pullen was one of the authors, and he's an economist, and he was talking about basically 75%, or I should say a carbon tax, global actual carbon tax. If we just allocated 25% of the revenue from that, assuming a $20 per ton carbon tax, that would generate about $160 billion, which if you distribute it across the population is about $60 a person, $240 for a family of four. So these are I think the policies that are currently getting the most attention, that are most popular, and that would have the least impact to society.
So how do we also apply, because here's the thing, if we apply the same thing to a global perspective, like, a global Green New Deal, how do we take the entire world off of carbon-based fuels and stop climate change while also not putting a disproportionate amount of the burden on poorer countries in the global south?
Sure. So let's take the example of the global Green New Deal that Robert Pullen was proposing, since we're on the topic. Where would the revenue come from? First of all, how much money would be needed? So he estimates that around $2.4 trillion beginning in 2024, extending to 2050, would be needed to basically keep. I think he was looking at the 1.5 degree Celsius target. So to keep us from that target of warming, assuming a $2.4 trillion a year investment, which would be scaled up over time, sounds like a lot. It's about 0.7% of the global asset pool. But where would that money come from? Like you're mentioning, without disproportionately impacting in underdeveloped countries and disadvantaged communities. So carbon tax, he proposes just taking again the $20 per ton carbon tax has been thrown out there quite a bit, and this so let's take that example: $20 per ton of carbon collected. This would be global. this would be, if you just took that right off the bat, would amount to about that, almost a little over $600 billion. If you took just a quarter of that, you're getting to pay off a fraction of already what he's explained. And let's think about what that means in terms of, let's say, gasoline, for instance. So for every dollar of tax that you apply, so $20 per ton, for every dollar, it comes to about an extra cent per gallon of gasoline. Average globally, it translates to only about a 5% increase in gasoline prices. Not too dramatic, I don't think, but let's continue down the example. So the military budget, which you're probably aware, as of 2018, $1.8 trillion, right? That's just military budget alone. The US alone, $700 billion of that, about 40%. So just skimming off a minuscule 6% in his calculations, just a minuscule 6% would translate right there to $100 billion annually. And that's actually a pretty, seemingly attainable percentage to redirect. And, if we truly believe the idea that military is intended to ensure security for its population, then this would be an extremely worthwhile thing to do, just to protect our population. We saw in 2007 to 9 financial crisis, around $12 trillion get pretty much thrown into the financial system on a dime to prevent market collapse and continue economic growth and so on and so forth. That suggests a real capacity for nations, particularly European and Western nations, to contribute meaningfully to a Green New Deal, global Green New Deal. So, if we estimate the US and Europe each contributing $150 billion, that gets us to $300 billion. That should be easily obtainable. That's just a percent of what was thrown on a dime to the financial crisis in 2008. Moving forward, elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. So it was recently estimated about $3 trillion are given to the fossil fuel companies in the form of subsidies globally. Now that's an astounding amount of number. Just redirecting that in its entirety would cover this $2.4 trillion necessity. Now, of course, 100%, removing all those subsidies would also have economic impacts. They wouldn't necessarily be favorable, especially to the communities you're talking about. But if we redirected, say, 25% of that right there is $750 billion. So those different things, those four major actions would cover that $2.4 trillion needed to achieve a global Green New Deal. And you saw that a fair fraction of that actually could come from the green bond lending and also redirection of military budget.